Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born on December 15th in the year 37 AD in Anzio, a small town on the Tyrrhenian coast. His birth was accompanied by dark omens, if Roman historians are to be believed. The boy's father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, came from an ancient patrician family known for its cruelty and depravity. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the great-granddaughter of Emperor Augustus and the daughter of the renowned general Germanicus. The blood of the empire's founder flowed in her veins, making her one of the most influential women in Rome. Lucius's childhood fell during the reign of Emperor Caligula, his maternal uncle. It was a time of terror and madness, when Rome trembled under the whims of the emperor, who fancied himself a living god. When the boy was 3 years old, his father died. Before his death, Gnaeus Domitius uttered words that were later repeated throughout Rome. From him and Agrippina, nothing but a monster, destructive to the state, can be born. Many remembered these words and later recalled them as a prophecy. After Caligula's death, assassinated by conspirators in 41 AD, Claudius, Agrippina's uncle, came to power. The new emperor confiscated the property of the Domitius family, and Agrippina and her son found themselves in straitened circumstances. The boy was raised by his paternal aunt, Lepida, a woman of modest means. Lucius's tutors were a dancer and a barber. Such an education was considered unworthy of a scion of a noble house, but Agrippina lacked the funds for better instructors. These years taught the future emperor to value art and spectacle more than military affairs and state sciences. Agrippina did not resign herself to the fate of an exiled relative of the emperor. She was a woman of extraordinary ambition and determination, ready to do anything to regain power. In 49 AD, she took a bold step that changed her son's destiny. Agrippina became the fourth wife of her uncle, Emperor Claudius. This required changing Roman laws that prohibited marriage between an uncle and his niece. The Senate, under the emperor's pressure, passed the necessary decree, and the wedding took place. Romans whispered about this union, but no one dared openly condemn the ruler's will. From the moment of the marriage, Agrippina began to systematically eliminate everyone who could prevent her son from ascending to the throne. Claudius had a legitimate son, Britannicus, the rightful heir. Agrippina acted with cold calculation. She persuaded the emperor to adopt Lucius. In 51 AD, the boy officially became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, the emperor's adopted son. He was 13 years old then. The adoption gave Nero an advantage over Britannicus, who was 3 years younger. Agrippina ensured that her son received an education worthy of a future ruler. His tutor became Lucius Annaeus Seneca, an outstanding Stoic philosopher, writer, and orator. Seneca was recalled from exile at Agrippina's insistence, specifically to teach Nero. The philosopher tried to instill in the young man a love for wisdom, moderation, and justice, the core virtues of Stoicism. However, the student's character was already being shaped by his mother, for whom power was paramount over all moral principles. In 53 AD, Nero married Octavia, the daughter of Emperor Claudius. This marriage strengthened his position at court. He was now not only the emperor's adopted son but also his son-in-law. Octavia was a quiet and modest girl, raised in the strict traditions of Roman nobility. The 16-year-old Nero accepted this union as a necessity but felt no genuine affection for his wife. He was drawn to entirely different pleasures: music, theater, chariot races. On October 13th, 54 AD, Emperor Claudius died under mysterious circumstances. It was officially announced that he had been poisoned by mushrooms at lunch. Roman historians almost unanimously accused Agrippina of the murder, although there was no direct evidence. It was said that poison had been added to a dish of mushrooms, which the emperor particularly loved. Claudius died at the age of 63. The path to the throne for Nero was open. On October 17th, the 17-year-old Nero was proclaimed emperor. The prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Sextus Afranius Burrus, a loyal ally of Agrippina, presented the young man to the soldiers. The Praetorians greeted the new ruler, tempted by the promised monetary reward. The Senate confirmed the election, lacking the real power to oppose the army's will. Thus began the reign of the fifth Roman emperor, which would last 14 years and leave an indelible mark on history. The first years of Nero's reign would later be called the Quinquennium Neronis, Nero's 5 years, a golden age of wise and just rule. The young emperor surrounded himself with capable advisors. The main ones were the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. These two experienced statesmen effectively governed the empire, guiding the inexperienced ruler. Seneca drafted the emperor's speeches for the Senate. Burrus controlled the army and maintained order in the capital. Nero, in the first months of his reign, displayed qualities that no one expected. He refused to sign death warrants, saying he would rather not know how to write than use that skill for executions. When senators asked him to approve another execution for alleged treason, the emperor replied that he wished all citizens were innocent. Such mercy sharply contrasted with the cruelty of previous rulers, especially Caligula and the last years of Claudius. In his first speech to the Senate, Nero promised to respect the senators' privileges and not interfere in judicial matters. He declared that he would rule in accordance with the traditions of the Republic, although everyone understood the conditional nature of these words. The empire had long ceased to be a republic, but respect for ancient institutions was valued. The senators listened with relief to the young emperor, remembering the despotism of his predecessors. Nero also promised to separate the state treasury from the emperor's personal funds, which was a novelty in the practice of governance. Real power in the early years belonged to Agrippina. The emperor's mother achieved unprecedented honors. Her images were minted on coins alongside her son's portrait. She attended Senate meetings, albeit from behind a special curtain, as women were forbidden to participate in the work of this body. Agrippina received foreign ambassadors, decided state matters, and effectively co-ruled with Nero. Some documents were signed with both names, Nero and Agrippina. However, such a situation could not last long. The young emperor gradually became weary of his mother's guardianship. Agrippina controlled his every step, chose his entourage, and dictated his decisions. Nero began to seek ways to free himself from this influence. The first sign of a break was the emperor's infatuation with the freedwoman Act, whom Agrippina vehemently opposed, considering the connection unworthy of an emperor. Nero openly disobeyed his mother for the first time, continuing his relationship with his beloved. The conflict between mother and son intensified, and Agrippina tried to use Britannicus, Claudius's natural son, as a means of pressure on Nero. She hinted that Britannicus, not the adopted son, was the true heir to the throne. These threats alarmed the emperor and his advisors. On February 11th, 55 AD, the day before Britannicus was to turn 14 and reach his majority, the young man died suddenly during a feast. Britannicus's death occurred in full view of everyone. During dinner at the imperial palace, the boy was served wine. After a sip, he fell to the floor in convulsions and soon died. Nero announced that Britannicus suffered from epilepsy and had died from a seizure. The body was immediately cremated at night in the pouring rain. No investigation was conducted. Roman historians unanimously claimed that Britannicus was poisoned on Nero's orders. The poison was prepared by the notorious poisoner Locusta, whom the emperor kept at court. After Britannicus's elimination, Agrippina's influence began to wane. Nero listened to her advice less and less, and surrounded himself with new favorites. His mother tried to regain control, but the emperor had already tasted the flavor of independent power. Seneca and Burrus supported Nero's desire to free himself from Agrippina's guardianship, seeing her influence as a threat to stability. They gradually removed her from state affairs, limiting her access to the emperor. During these years, Rome prospered. Nero organized generous distributions of grain and money to the people and staged magnificent spectacles. He built a wooden amphitheater on the Campus Martius where gladiatorial combats and animal hunts were held. The emperor patronized the arts, inviting the best actors and musicians to Rome. He himself spent hours singing and playing the cithara, dreaming of an artistic career. Such pursuits were considered unworthy of an emperor, but Nero paid no attention to the nobility's condemnation. The empire's foreign policy also developed successfully. A war was waged in Armenia against Parthia for influence in this strategically important kingdom. The Roman general Corbulo achieved victories, strengthening the eastern borders. Rebellions of local tribes were suppressed in Britain. The province gradually Romanized. Syria, Egypt, and Africa remained calm and prosperous. Taxes flowed in regularly. The treasury was replenished, allowing the emperor to spend generously on construction and entertainment. By 59 AD, relations between Nero and Agrippina had reached a critical point. The emperor finally freed himself from his mother's influence, depriving her of her guard and evicting her from the palace. Agrippina settled in her own house but continued to plot, trying to regain her lost power. She gathered dissatisfied individuals around her, criticized her son's decisions, and reminded him of her services in his rise to power. Nero saw her as a threat and began to consider a final solution to the problem. The emperor tried to poison his mother several times, using Locusta's services. However, Agrippina, well aware of the danger, took antidotes and tested food on slaves. The poison had no effect. Nero then ordered the ceiling of his mother's bedroom to be collapsed. But this plan also failed. Agrippina miraculously escaped death, having learned of the planned assassination in advance. It became clear that ordinary methods of murder would not work against an experienced and cautious woman. In March 59 AD, Nero invited his mother to celebrate the Quinquatria in Baiae, a resort town on the Bay of Naples. Agrippina accepted the invitation, hoping for reconciliation with her son. The emperor met her with ostentatious cordiality and hosted a lavish feast. After the celebration, Nero escorted his mother to a ship that was supposed to take her back to Rome. He hugged Agrippina for a long time at farewell, kissing her eyes and chest. It was their last meeting. The ship on which Agrippina sailed was specially designed to fall apart at sea. The mechanism was supposed to activate when the vessel had sailed far enough from the shore. The plan was for the wreck to look like an accident. At night, when the ship was at sea, part of the deck collapsed. One of Agrippina's companions, Crepida Galla, died immediately. Agrippina herself, along with her loyal servant Asaronia Pola, ended up in the water. Asaronia, trying to save her mistress, began to shout that she was Agrippina and needed to be saved. The conspiratorial sailors immediately killed her with oars and clubs. The real Agrippina remained silent and, despite a wounded shoulder, swam towards the shore. She was an experienced swimmer and managed to reach fishing boats that took her to safety. The emperor immediately learned of the plan's failure. Agrippina was alive and understood that an assassination attempt had occurred. Reaching her villa in Baiae, Agrippina sent a letter to Nero through the freedman Aegyptus. In her message, she reported the shipwreck, her rescue, and hinted that she understood the true reason for the incident. However, she wrote that she did not wish to see her son, so as not to burden him with worry about her health. These cautious words showed that Agrippina still hoped for a compromise, not wanting an open conflict. Nero was horrified by the plan's failure and the news of his mother's survival. He convened an emergency meeting with Seneca and Burrus. The emperor understood that there was no turning back. Agrippina knew about the assassination attempt and could rally the Senate and Praetorians against him. Burrus refused to use the guards to kill the emperor's mother, stating that the soldiers remembered Agrippina's father, the great Germanicus, and would not raise their hand against his daughter. It was then decided to involve naval officers. That same night, a detachment led by the prefect of the fleet, Anicetus, set out for Agrippina's villa. The house was surrounded. The servants dispersed or killed. Agrippina met the murderers in her bedroom. She had only one servant with her. When armed men burst into the room, the servant fled, and Agrippina was left alone before the assassins. According to historical accounts, she pointed to her abdomen and said, "Strike the womb." These were her last words. She was 44 years old. Agrippina's body was cremated that same night on her funeral couch without honors or mourning rites. Her ashes were not buried in the family mausoleum of the Julio-Claudians. Later, Agrippina's slaves secretly collected the remains and buried them in a humble grave. Nero did not attend his mother's cremation. He remained in his palace, awaiting news of the completion of the deed. When Anicetus reported Agrippina's death, the emperor, according to eyewitnesses, fell into a strange state between relief and horror. Nero returned to Rome only after Seneca drafted a letter to the Senate for him. The message claimed that Agrippina had plotted an assassination attempt on the emperor, had been caught in a conspiracy, and had committed suicide, not wishing to stand trial. All her alleged crimes were listed, including her affair with a freedman and attempts to seize power. The Senate accepted the emperor's explanation, declared Agrippina an enemy of the state, and decreed thanksgiving sacrifices to the gods for Nero's salvation. After his mother's murder, Nero changed. Remorse, if any, soon gave way to relief from newfound freedom. He finally broke with the caution of the early years of his reign. The emperor began to openly indulge his passions, disregarding the aristocracy's opinion. He spent nights at parties, wandered through Rome incognito with a company of debauched youths, attacked passers-by, and robbed shops. These were not mere amusements, but a demonstration that the laws did not apply to him. His passion for theater and music grew into an obsession. Nero genuinely considered himself a great artist and demanded recognition of this talent from his subjects. In 61 AD, he organized the Juvenalia, festive games in honor of his first shaving of his beard. During these games, the emperor performed publicly for the first time as an actor and singer. Senators and equestrians were obliged to attend his performance and applaud enthusiastically. This was a scandal for the Roman nobility, who considered acting a pastime of slaves and freedmen. Relations with his wife Octavia deteriorated completely. Nero openly neglected her and had numerous affairs. His main passion became Poppaea Sabina, a beauty who was the wife of the prefect Otho. Poppaea was an ambitious and calculating woman. She seduced the emperor but refused to be merely his mistress, demanding marriage. Nero was ready to divorce Octavia, but Burrus and Seneca dissuaded him, understanding that a divorce from the daughter of the deified Claudius would cause outrage. In 62 AD, Burrus died. The official cause was a throat illness, but many suspected poisoning. With his death, Seneca lost his main ally. The new praetorian prefect became Ophonius Tigellinus, an unscrupulous courtier ready to fulfill any whim of the emperor. Tigellinus came from an obscure family and made his career through cruelty and obsequiousness. He encouraged Nero's worst inclinations, seeing it as a way to strengthen his own power. Shortly after Tigellinus's appointment, Nero divorced Octavia. She was accused of adultery with the flutist Evocatus and of infertility. Octavia was exiled to the island of Pandataria. 12 days after the divorce, in June 62 AD, Nero married Poppaea. However, Romans had not forgotten the virtuous daughter of Claudius. The people openly expressed sympathy for Octavia. Her statues were decorated with flowers, and portraits of the new empress were torn down. Nero was furious at such disobedience. Octavia was then accused of treason and conspiracy. She was forced to cut her veins. The girl was only 22 years old. Octavia's head was delivered to Poppaea as proof of the elimination of a rival. The death of the innocent empress caused outrage even among those who usually supported Nero. However, no one dared to protest openly. The era of terror was beginning, and people learned to remain silent. Seneca understood that his time at court was over. The philosopher repeatedly asked the emperor for retirement, offering to return all the wealth accumulated during his years of service. Nero formally refused, but effectively removed his mentor from influence. Seneca retired to his estates, where he devoted himself to literary work. He could no longer influence the emperor, who had completely abandoned the Stoic principles he had been taught in his youth. During these years, Nero indulged in increasingly insane pleasures. He organized grand feasts where wine flowed freely and debauchery knew no bounds. The emperor appeared at these celebrations in women's clothing, forcing noble matrons and senators to participate in indecent performances. On Lake Regillus, he built a raft with chambers decorated with gold and precious stones. The raft was towed by decorated ships. Taverns stood along the shores, offering the services of courtesans. In 65 AD, a tragedy occurred that finally shattered the emperor's already unstable psyche. Poppaea, who was pregnant again, died under tragic circumstances. During a family quarrel, a drunken Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked his wife in the stomach. The pregnant empress died from her injuries. Tacitus writes that the cause of her death was her husband, who in a fit of sudden rage, struck her. Nero was overcome with despair. Poppaea was not cremated according to custom but was embalmed and buried in the mausoleum of Augustus. The Senate deified her at the insistence of the emperor, who was plunged into deep mourning. After Poppaea's death, the emperor found solace in a strange affection. He met a young man named Sporus, who remarkably resembled the deceased empress in his facial features. Obsessed with this resemblance, Nero ordered the boy castrated and officially married him, holding a full wedding ceremony. Sporus wore women's clothes and imperial regalia. He was called Madam. This relationship shocked even the Romans accustomed to depravity. However, no one dared criticize the emperor, remembering the fate of those who expressed dissatisfaction. Nero's policies became increasingly repressive. The slightest suspicion of disloyalty was punished by death. Denunciations flourished, and the wealth of executed individuals replenished the imperial treasury. Senators lived in constant fear, not knowing what the next day would bring. The atmosphere of terror resembled the worst times of Caligula. Rome, which had prospered in the early years of Nero's reign, was turning into a state where fear and arbitrariness reigned. The night of July 19th, 64 AD, changed the face of Rome forever. Fire broke out in the shops at the foot of the Palatine Hill, where flammable goods were sold: oil, wood, fabrics. The wooden structures, tightly packed in narrow alleys, ignited instantly. The wind carried sparks to neighboring houses. People woke up in smoke and flames, not understanding what was happening. Panic began. The fire spread rapidly through the city. The flames devoured the insulae. Multi-story apartment buildings where the poor lived. People jumped from windows, suffocated in smoke, and died under collapsing walls. Narrow streets turned into fiery traps. The flames leaped from block to block, meeting no serious obstacles. The Roman fire brigades, the vigils, tried to fight the fire, but their efforts were futile against such a force of nature. At the time of the fire's outbreak, Nero was in Antium, his hometown, 50 kilometers from the capital. When news of the disaster reached him, the emperor immediately returned to Rome. He personally supervised the firefighting, organized rescue operations, and opened public buildings and his gardens to the homeless. The emperor ordered the distribution of bread from state reserves and reduced its price. These measures saved thousands of lives and temporarily restored Nero's popularity with the common people. The fire raged for 6 days. By July 25th, the fire was brought under control, but then it flared up again in another part of the city. The second wave of fire lasted for another 3 days. In total, the catastrophe lasted 9 days. Out of 14 districts of Rome, 4 were completely destroyed. 7 were seriously damaged. Only 3 remained untouched. Ancient temples and treasure vaults burned down, as did the homes of hundreds of thousands of people. The losses were colossal. Almost immediately, rumors began to spread that the fire had been set intentionally. It was said that people with torches had been seen setting fire to houses and hindering firefighting. Stories circulated that the emperor wanted to clear space for a new palace. The most famous legend claimed that Nero, during the fire, stood on the tower of Maecenas and sang about the fall of Troy, enjoying the spectacle of the burning city. However, this story is almost certainly a fabrication by later authors. Contemporary historians find no convincing evidence of Nero's guilt in arson. Roman chroniclers report his active participation in firefighting and assistance to the victims. The fire also destroyed the imperial palace on the Palatine, which would have been strange if he himself had organized the arson. Most likely, the fire started accidentally, and the rumors of intentional arson arose from hatred towards the emperor and his subsequent actions. However, the people needed a scapegoat. Nero understood the danger of the accusations. To deflect suspicion from himself, he ordered Tigellinus to find scapegoats. The choice fell on the Christians, a small religious sect that Romans considered dangerous and alien. Christians refused to worship the emperor and the traditional gods, making them suspicious in the eyes of the authorities. They were accused not only of arson but also of hatred for humanity. Arrests began. Christians were seized throughout the city, subjected to torture, and forced to name their fellow believers. The first executions took place in Nero's private gardens on the Vatican Hill. Christians were dressed in animal skins and savaged by dogs. They were crucified, smeared with pitch, and set on fire at night, used as living torches to illuminate the gardens. The emperor staged a grand spectacle in the gardens, riding among the burning people in the costume of a charioteer. The cruelty of the executions was such that even Romans hostile to Christians began to feel pity for them. The historian Tacitus, writing half a century later and not harboring sympathy for Christians, noted that the executions exceeded all measure and evoked sympathy for the victims. People understood that Christians were being killed not for a crime but to satisfy the cruelty of one man. It was under Nero that the first large-scale persecutions of Christians in Rome began. Among those who died during these days, according to Christian tradition, were the apostles Peter and Paul. Peter was crucified head down at his own request, considering himself unworthy to die as Christ had. Paul, a Roman citizen, was beheaded. These executions turned both into martyrs of the early church. The place of their burial later became sacred to Christians. The first basilicas were built there, marking the beginning of the Vatican complex. From the ashes, Rome began to be rebuilt, but according to a new plan, Nero used the catastrophe to implement a grandiose project. He ordered the center of the city to be rebuilt according to his design, with the new imperial residence taking pride of place. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, was to be the embodiment of the emperor's ideas of luxury and grandeur. This was not just a palace but a vast complex occupying 120 hectares in the very center of Rome. The architects of the project were Severus and Celer, engineers renowned for their inventiveness. They created something unprecedented for Roman architecture. The palace included countless halls decorated with gold, precious stones, and mother-of-pearl. The walls were covered with frescoes executed by the best artist of the time. Fabulous. The ceilings of some rooms were movable and could rotate, showering guests with flowers and perfumes, imitating the celestial vault. The main hall of the palace, the octagonal dining room, was a masterpiece of engineering. Its dome rotated continuously day and night, like the celestial sphere. The walls were clad in polished marble, reflecting the light of numerous lamps. Waterfalls and fountains created a constant sound of water. One of the rooms had seawater, another sulphurous water from the Albula spring. Nero wanted each room of the palace to offer a new sensation of luxury. Gardens, designed to resemble wild nature, spread around the palace. Wild animals brought from various provinces of the empire roamed there. Deer, roe deer, exotic birds. In the center of the vast park was an artificial lake, surrounded by buildings imitating cities, vineyards and fields of the countryside in the midst of the capital. Nero wanted to own the whole world without leaving his residence. At the entrance to the complex stood a colossal statue of Nero himself, about 35 meters high. The colossus depicted the emperor in the guise of the sun god Helios, with a radiant crown on his head. The statue was created by the sculptor Zenodorus, who worked on it for several years. It was so immense that a cart pulled by oxen could pass through it. Later emperors changed the face of the statue, but the colossus itself stood for a century and gave its name to the Colosseum, built nearby. The construction of the palace required colossal funds. The provinces were burdened with additional taxes, temples were robbed, and the property of condemned individuals was confiscated. Nero sent special expeditions to Greece to confiscate statues and treasures from famous sanctuaries. Senators complained that the emperor was ruining the state for his personal whim. However, no one dared to openly criticize the project, knowing the fate of those who disagreed. Romans viewed the construction with mixed feelings. On the one hand, the city, reborn after the fire, received a more rational layout. Nero issued building regulations that prohibited excessively tall buildings and required wider streets. Houses were now built of stone, not wood, with porticos for sun protection. These measures truly made Rome safer and more comfortable to live in. On the other hand, the Golden House occupied a vast territory in the city center that could have been used for public needs. The citizens watched with bitterness as the best lands were allocated to the imperial residents. Inscriptions appeared on the walls. Rome is turning into one house. Citizens, move to Veii. The latter was sarcasm. Veii, an ancient Etruscan city, had long lain in ruins. When construction was completed, Nero surveyed his new palace and said, "Finally, I can begin to live like a human." This phrase outraged Romans, who were living in modest dwellings after the fire. For the emperor, the norm of human life required unprecedented luxury. For his subjects, his life appeared as an offensive demonstration of extravagance. The gap between the ruler and the people grew wider. The Golden House did not last long. After Nero's death, his successors dismantled the palace, seeking to erase the memory of the hated emperor. Vespasian drained the lake and built the Flavian Amphitheater, the future Colosseum, in its place. The baths of Titus and Trajan were erected over the imperial chambers. The palace grounds were returned to the people, transforming the area into public structures. However, the underground parts of the Golden House were preserved and rediscovered during the Renaissance. In 66 AD, Nero undertook a journey he had dreamed of his entire life. He traveled to Greece, the cradle of art and culture, a country he considered his spiritual homeland. For the emperor, this was an opportunity to realize his artistic ambitions before an audience far removed from Roman prejudices regarding imperial dignity. The Greeks saw nothing shameful in a ruler performing on stage and participating in competitions. The journey began in Corinth, where the Isthmian Games were held. Nero participated in musical competitions, performing as a kitharode and singer. He adhered to strict artists' rules. During his performance, he did not leave the stage and wiped his sweat only with his cloak. He tried not to cough or blow his nose publicly. The emperor believed his voice required care and maintained a vocal regimen. placing lead plates on his chest to develop his breathing. The judges awarded Nero victory after victory. It is difficult to say how sincere these decisions were. On the one hand, the emperor genuinely possessed musical talent and had practiced singing for years. On the other hand, who would dare deny victory to the ruler of the greatest empire? Nero accepted the winner's wreaths with childlike joy, as if he truly believed in the judges' fairness. He collected over 1,000 wreaths during his tour of Greece. In Olympia, the emperor participated in chariot races. He drove a chariot pulled by 10 horses, which was unprecedented for traditional competitions. During the race, Nero was thrown from the chariot and could not finish. Nevertheless, the judges awarded him victory, explaining that he would have finished the race if not for the unfortunate accident. This decision caused smiles even among the flattering courtiers, but the emperor accepted the wreath with visible pleasure. In addition to performances, Nero engaged in state affairs. In Corinth, he announced the granting of freedom to all of Greece, freeing the province from taxes and submission to Roman governors. This was a grand gesture, though short-lived. Nero's successors revoked this decree. The emperor also ordered the construction of a canal across the Isthmus of Corinth. Work began with a solemn ceremony, where Nero himself dug the earth with a golden spade. The canal project was grandiose. 6,000 Jewish prisoners captured during the Jewish War toiled at the excavations. However, it soon became clear that the task was impossible with the available technology. Engineers encountered hard rock that they could not penetrate. After Nero's death, work stopped. The canal was only completed in the 19th century, 1,800 years after construction began. During his Greek tour, Nero received disturbing news from Rome. Governors in the provinces expressed discontent. A conspiracy was brewing in the capital. However, the emperor did not hurry to return, immersed in the atmosphere of triumph. The Greeks admired him, calling him the new Apollo, the god of arts. These raptures, sincere or feigned, intoxicated Nero more than wine. He felt recognized as a genius surrounded by people capable of appreciating his talent. While the emperor reveled in glory in Greece, events were brewing in Rome that would turn his destiny upside down. Legates of legions in the provinces watched the unfolding events with growing indignation. They saw Nero's behavior as an insult to Roman dignity. The emperor, who was supposed to command armies and govern the state, performed as an actor and musician. Activities considered unworthy of a free man, let alone a ruler. Military leaders, remembering the harsh glory of previous emperors, were particularly indignant. Augustus created the empire. Tiberius was a great commander. Even the mad Caligula at least simulated military campaigns. Claudius conquered Britain. Nero, however, did not participate in any military campaign, preferring the stage to the battlefield. For Roman legionaries, whose culture was steeped in military values, such behavior was unforgivable. The emperor's return to Rome was staged as a triumphal procession of a victor. He entered the city on Augustus's chariot, dressed in a Greek cloak adorned with stars. Nero wore the Olympic wreath on his head. Behind him, all the other conquered wreaths were carried. The procession passed through a specially made breach in the circus wall. Musicians and singers followed the emperor. Crowds shouted about his victories. However, behind the ostentatious jubilation lay growing discontent. Returning from Greece in early 68 AD, Nero found the empire on the verge of chaos. During his absence, problems had accumulated that required immediate solutions. A war was raging in Judea, which had begun 2 years earlier. The Jewish rebellion against Roman rule had reached catastrophic proportions. Vespasian's legions needed reinforcements and clear instructions, but the emperor was busy organizing new performances. The financial situation of the empire was catastrophic. The treasury was depleted due to the insane spending on the Golden House and the Greek journey. Nero ordered the gold and silver statues from temples to be melted down and reduced the precious metal content in coins. These measures caused inflation and outrage among the priests. The emperor confiscated the property of wealthy citizens on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty, turning terror into a method of replenishing the treasury. Discontent was brewing in the provinces. Gaul suffered from unbearable taxes levied to finance the emperor's whims. The governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, a representative of a noble Gallic family who had received complaints from the local aristocracy, took an unprecedented step. In March 68 AD, he launched a rebellion. declaring Nero an enemy of humanity and calling for his overthrow. Vindex commanded not legions but auxiliary troops, which weakened his position. However, his uprising was more of a political act than a military campaign. The Gaul sent letters to other governors, urging them to join the rebellion. Most ignored the call, but one man responded. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania, a 70-year-old aristocrat from an ancient family, declared himself legate of the Senate and the Roman people. Nero initially did not take the threat seriously. Upon receiving news of Vindex's rebellion, he continued to participate in theatrical performances. Only a few days later did the emperor convene the Senate. But instead of discussing military measures, he showed the senators a new water-powered musical machine. Such behavior shocked even those accustomed to his eccentricities. It seemed Nero had lost touch with reality. When news of the rebellion scale reached the emperor, he fell into a panic. Nero wavered between extremes. Sometimes he planned to personally lead the troops and appease the rebels with tears and singing. Other times he schemed to flee to the Parthians and seek refuge with Rome's enemies. He considered appointing himself governor of Egypt, the only province where he was still loved for his regular grain distributions. None of these plans were realized. Vindex's troops were defeated by the legions of Upper Germany, under the command of Virginius Rufus. Vindex himself died in battle in May 68 AD. It seemed the threat had passed. However, Virginius's victory did not bring Nero relief. The legions of Germany proclaimed their commander emperor, but he refused the honor. Meanwhile, Galba in Spain continued to gather forces, attracting more and more supporters. The decisive blow was not delivered by an enemy but by the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, who succeeded Tigellinus, made a secret agreement with Galba. He promised the Praetorians a huge reward from the new emperor for switching their allegiance. On June 8, 68 AD, the guards declared Nero an enemy of the state and proclaimed Galba emperor. The Senate immediately confirmed the Praetorians' decision. Nero learned of the betrayal at night. He woke up to find the palace empty. The guard had left. The servants had fled, taking everything they could carry. The emperor, in terror, ran through the empty chambers, shouting the names of his closest associates. No one responded. He tried to find the poison he always carried, but the vial was gone. Nero rushed to the Tiber, intending to drown himself, but did not dare. The only one who remained loyal to the emperor was the freedman Phaon. He offered Nero refuge at his villa, 4 miles from Rome. The emperor, pulling a cloak over his head, mounted a horse barefoot, clad only in a tunic. He was accompanied by only 4 people. They had to ride through bushes and thorns along roundabout paths to avoid encountering patrols. The ground crunched under the horses' hooves. The road was strewn with broken pottery. Nero heard the shouts of soldiers searching for him, smelled the smoke from bonfires. The former master of the world hid like a criminal. At Phaon's villa, they had to dismount and make their way through thorny bushes to the back entrance. Nero scratched his hands and face on the thorns, tearing his tunic. He was led into a small room for slaves, where a reed mat was laid on the floor. The emperor lay down, covered with an old cloak. He was brought stale bread and warm water, but he refused to eat. Nero only asked for water to quench his thirst after the ride. Soon a messenger arrived with news that the Senate had declared Nero an enemy of the state and condemned him to death according to ancient custom. The condemned was to be stripped naked, his head placed in a wooden yoke, and then beaten to death with rods. Hearing this, the emperor shuddered and grabbed 2 daggers he had brought with him. He tested the edge of each but dared not strike. "What a great artist is perishing," Nero repeated, rocking on the mat. Time passed, and the emperor hesitated. He recited poems about death, recalled lines from tragedies. Phaon begged him to end his life before the soldiers arrived. The loyal freedmen wept, watching their master's indecision. Finally, the sound of hooves was heard. Horsemen were galloping, sent to capture Nero alive. The emperor placed a dagger to his throat, but his hand trembled. Then his secretary, Epaphroditus, helped him, directing the blow. The dagger entered his neck, but not fatally. When the centurion burst into the room, Nero was still alive. The officer tried to stop the bleeding by pressing the wound with a cloak, but the emperor whispered, "Too late. Here is loyalty." These were his last words. Nero died in the centurion's arms on June 9, 68 AD. He was 30 years and 7 months old. He reigned for 13 years, 7 months, and 28 days. Nero's death did not bring Rome the long-awaited peace. On the contrary, it opened Pandora's box, from which chaos and civil war erupted. The year 69 AD went down in history as the year of the four emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian succeeded each other on the throne. Each came to power on the bayonets of legions. The army understood its strength. Emperors were now made not in the Senate but in legionary camps. Galba entered Rome surrounded by legionaries who, before his eyes, had killed thousands of people suspected of loyalty to Nero. The 70-year-old emperor proved to be a stingy, harsh, and short-sighted ruler. He refused to pay the praetorians the promised reward by Nymphidius, stating that he was accustomed to recruiting soldiers, not buying them. This phrase cost him his throne and his life. In January 69 AD, the guards killed Galba in the Forum and proclaimed Otho emperor. Marcus Salvius Otho was Nero's childhood friend, the very man whose wife Poppaea, the emperor, had seduced. Nero had sent Otho as governor to distant Lusitania, removing a rival from Rome. Now Otho returned as emperor, but his reign lasted only 3 months. The legions of Germany proclaimed Vitellius emperor. Hostilities began. Otho's armies were defeated, and he committed suicide, not wishing to continue the civil war. Vitellius entered the capital in the summer of 69 AD. A fat and gluttonous gourmet, he spent his time at feasts while the empire crumbled. His reign was a nightmare of gluttony amidst universal hunger. Meanwhile, the legions of the East, fighting in Judea, proclaimed their commander Vespasian emperor. A new war began. In December, Vespasian's troops stormed Rome. Vitellius was killed in the Forum, dragged through the streets on a hook. Titus Flavius Vespasian put an end to the chaos. He came from a simple Italian family and made his career through military merit. Vespasian restored discipline in the army and order in finances and began large-scale construction. His most important decision was the destruction of everything that reminded people of Nero. The Golden House was dismantled, the lake drained, and the Colossus was altered. The Flavian Amphitheater, a symbol of the return of lands usurped by the tyrant to the people, rose on the site of the imperial residence. However, the memory of Nero did not disappear so easily. Among the common people, rumors persisted that the emperor was alive and hiding in the east. Impostors appeared, claiming to be Nero. One of them, who appeared in Asia Minor a year after the emperor's death, gathered a significant number of supporters. He even managed to win over the Parthian king before the deception was revealed. The phenomenon of pseudo-Nerones continued for almost 20 years. The eastern provinces, in particular, retained their attachment to Nero's memory for a long time. In Greece and Egypt, he was remembered as a generous patron and a liberator from the tax burden. The common people were not interested in palace intrigues and the murder of senators. For them, grain distributions, spectacles, and tax reductions were important. In these provinces, Nero was sincerely mourned, with flowers laid at his statues and prayers for the repose of his soul. Attitudes in the West were different. The aristocracy, who had survived years of terror, perceived Nero's death as a deliverance. Historians belonging to the senatorial class created the image of the emperor as a monster, a tyrant, a mother-killer, and the arsonist of Rome. This image became entrenched in historical memory. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio wrote about Nero with outright hatred, not hiding their bias, and their testimonies became the basis for subsequent generations. Christian tradition added its own colors to Nero's portrait. The first persecutions made him the embodiment of evil for the early church. In Christian apocalyptic texts, Nero appears as the Antichrist, the precursor of the end of the world. The number of the beast, 666, from the Book of Revelation, according to one interpretation, represents the numerical value of the name Nero Caesar, written in Hebrew letters. This interpretation transformed the emperor into a demonic figure. Archaeological discoveries of recent centuries have somewhat adjusted the image of Nero. The discovery of the remains of the Golden House revealed not only insane luxury but also the engineering genius of the builders. The frescoes of fabulous amazed Renaissance artists, inspiring them to create grotesques. Coins from Nero's time testify to the prosperity of trade. Inscriptions from the provinces speak of gratitude to the emperor for specific benevolent deeds. The picture turned out to be more complex than the unambiguous assessments of ancient authors. Modern historians attempt to separate facts from propaganda. Undoubtedly, Nero committed grave crimes. The murder of his mother, his wife Octavia, and many innocent people are historical facts. Reprisals against Christians, although not unique for their time, were distinguished by particular cruelty. The emperor's extravagance brought state finances to the brink of disaster. His neglect of military duty undermined discipline in the army. At the same time, the positive aspects of his reign cannot be ignored. The first 5 years were a time of just governance and prosperity. Nero carried out a judicial reform that limited arbitrary actions. He supported the arts, built public buildings, and improved Rome's layout after the fire. His diplomacy in the East was successful. The conflict with Parthia was resolved through negotiations. The liberation of Greece, though later revoked, was an act of cultural recognition. Nero's figure has remained a subject of debate and reinterpretation for 2 millennia. Each era saw in the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty a reflection of its own fears and fantasies. The Middle Ages perceived him as absolute evil, the embodiment of the Antichrist. The Renaissance became interested in the artistic side of his nature. The Enlightenment saw in him an example of despotism that should be fought against. The 19th century romanticized Nero's image. Writers and playwrights created works where the emperor appears as a tragic hero, a victim of circumstances and his own passions. Monteverdi's opera The Coronation of Poppaea presented the emperor's love story in a sympathetic light. Henryk Sienkiewicz's novel Quo Vadis contrasted the cruel Nero with noble Christian martyrs, creating a canonical image for mass culture. The 20th century brought attempts to revise established views. Historians began to critically analyze sources, identifying the bias of ancient authors. It became clear that Tacitus and Suetonius wrote decades after the events, relying on rumors and senatorial tradition hostile to Nero. Many accusations are impossible to verify. They remain at the level of historical anecdotes. The image of the emperor playing the lyre during the fire is most likely a fabrication. Modern science approaches Nero's personality with caution. He was a complex figure, combining artistic talent with cruelty, generosity with extravagance, a desire for popularity with contempt for tradition, and his tragedy lay in the fact that he received absolute power without possessing the qualities to use it. Raised in an atmosphere of palace intrigue, deprived of his father, and under pressure from a domineering mother, Nero did not learn to distinguish the permissible from the impermissible. The influence of Greek culture shaped his idea of the ruler's role. In Hellenistic monarchies, kings patronized the arts and participated in competitions themselves. This was considered honorable. Roman tradition was different. For Romans, the emperor was primarily a commander, the first citizen, the guardian of ancient customs. Music and theater were unworthy pursuits. Nero tried to combine the incompatible, to become a Greek king in a Roman toga. This contradiction led to his downfall. The Julio-Claudian dynasty ended with Nero. The last descendant of Augustus left no heirs. It is true that there were rumors of a daughter with Claudia Augusta, the emperor's mistress, but the child died in infancy. Poppaea gave birth to a daughter named Claudia, but the girl died at 4 months of age. With Nero's death, the connection stretching back to the founder of the empire was broken. Power passed to new people, unrelated to the previous ruling family. The era of the Augustan Principate ended. The system where the emperor formally shared power with the Senate gave way to open military dictatorship. The events of 68 and 69 AD showed that real power in the empire belonged to the legions. Subsequent emperors would remember this lesson. The Flavian dynasty, founded by Vespasian, would begin a new era where imperial power was based primarily on the army. Nero left behind architectural monuments that descendants continue to debate. His contribution to Rome's urban planning was significant. The building regulations introduced after the fire made the city safer. Wide streets, stone buildings, and porticos became the standard for Roman urban construction for centuries. Of course, the Golden House was demolished, but its influence on architecture proved long-lasting. The engineering solutions employed by Severus and Celer were studied and copied by subsequent generations of architects. In music and poetry, Nero also left a mark, albeit indirectly. His patronage of artists stimulated the development of Roman theater and musical art. Although the emperor's own works have not survived, descriptions by contemporaries speak of the high level of his performances. Nero was the first Roman ruler who seriously engaged in art. seeing in it not just entertainment but the meaning of life. This stance was unusual for the Roman aristocracy. Nero's religious policy had unforeseen consequences. The persecution of Christians, intended as a diversion after the fire, paradoxically contributed to the strengthening of the new religion. The martyrdom of the apostles Peter and Paul turned Rome into a sacred city for Christians. The blood of martyrs, as Tertullian famously said, became the seed of the church. The Christian community of Rome, having gone through the fire of persecution, was forged and became one of the centers for the spread of the new faith. For historical scholarship, Nero's reign remains a crucial period for understanding the crisis of the Principate. His reign demonstrated the weakness of a system where all power was concentrated in the hands of one person, without mechanisms of control. The dynastic principle of power transfer meant that an emperor could be someone completely unprepared for governance. Nero's adoption by Claudius was the result of palace intrigues, not a rational choice. The story of Nero teaches the danger of absolute power, which corrupts even those who begin their reign with good intentions. The youth who promised wise and merciful rule ended his life as a hated tyrant, abandoned by all. The path from the golden quinquennium to the catastrophe of his later years shows how quickly power can degrade when deprived of counterbalances. Advisors like Seneca and Burrus restrained the emperor's worst inclinations, but after their departure, nothing hindered his fall. The 20 centuries that have passed since Nero's death have not erased him from human memory. His name has become a byword for a cruel tyrant, a mad despot, an artist on the throne. However, the simplified image created by ancient historians and solidified by Christian tradition is gradually giving way to a more complex and nuanced picture. Nero was a man of his time, a product of a cruel system where murder was a common political tool and human life was cheap. He dreamed of artistic fame, but received the power of an emperor. He sought recognition for his talent but achieved only the fear of his subjects. He wanted to leave behind beautiful creations but is remembered for his crimes. Nero's tragedy lies in the discrepancy between his true desires and his actual role. Perhaps if he had been born in another time, without the burden of the imperial crown, he would have simply become a talented musician or actor. History decided otherwise. The fifth emperor of Rome remained in the annals not as the artist he wanted to be, but as a symbol of tyranny and the madness of power.